Thank you all for coming. Just wanting to introduce Aaron, but first introduce myself. My name is Chris Golden. I'm the Associate Director of the Planetary Health Alliance. Dr. Aaron Jenkins is the inaugural Research Fellow in Planetary Health at the University of Sydney and Edith Cowan University. In Sydney, he's based at the School of Public Health and the Marie Bashir Institute for Infectious Diseases and Biosecurity. In Perth, at Edith Cowan University, he works for the Center for Ecosystem Management, and he's spent 20 years on international development experiences across 12 countries in Oceania, working on integrated issues of health, water resource management, and climate change mitigation. He's an internationally recognized specialist in wetland ecology, freshwater fishes, and is really interested in trying to connect the dots in a very holistic way between ecosystem change, freshwater quality, infectious disease, nutrition, and a variety of other things. I've been fortunate enough to know Aaron for the past kind of 5 to 10 years now, I guess, and we're really glad to have him here, so thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you. I've decided to kind of change my title slightly from turds to typhoid because it's a little bit more accurate and probably a bit more to the point than an older version of this talk which I had, which was called Floods, Feces and Fishes. I'll talk briefly in this talk, describe the region, then read a small vignette of island life, and reflecting on this, I'll highlight the public health and conservation imperatives of the region, and then try and unpack this vignette a little bit using the water catchment as a setting for planetary health, research, and action. This will be in the context of climate change and natural disasters, aquatic biodiversity loss, and waterborne infectious disease, and how these connect as nested systems. I'll conclude with some recommendations for future research directions and the basic tools of engagement needed to achieve these. So, this is the region of Oceania where I've been living and working for most of my life, where all the red dots are. It's in this region that it's almost a third of their surface. Developing Pacific islands are only about 1.5% land. In contrast to this small land area, the maritime area under national jurisdictions is vast. It's about 30% of the world's declared economic zones, under the jurisdiction of 14 independent countries and 15 territorial dependencies. There's some 200 high islands, which are volcanic, some also with raised limestone, and 2,500 low islands and atolls, which are usually low limestone or organic origin. I'm going to read a short vignette of island life and so as you listen to this, try and create a mental image beyond what's just shown here. So, on a new moon, after the storm, men, women, and children speak and laugh excitedly, ambling along the beach towards the river mouth, carrying fine mesh scoop nets and dry firewood. It's that time again. Smoke rises and dissipates in the moist, salty morning breeze. Many are there already, busily tending fires on the riverbank and waiting eagerly with their nets to where the fresh water mixes with sea. Looking into the shimmering clear water, they see thousands of tiny eyes surging upstream as shoals of almost transparent post-larval fishes begin following the freshwater plume upstream into the island interior. It is the keenly anticipated season of the whitebait run. White gold. A noisy flock of terns dives urgently among the scooping nets. Silver trevally glint and charge at the hordes of tiny fish, running the gauntlet, hugging the river's emerald edge, hiding under overhanging vegetation and among the flotsam. Many years later, as adults, some are caught upstream, filling inland pots and bellies. Some grow into iridescent stream dwellers, living to reproduce, with their own larvae meandering back to the warm ocean once again. Those who grace the scoop nets today are carried ashore and packed carefully into bamboo segments. A few segments find the fire, a subtle, smoky, fishy flavor to be savored, but most are bound for market, where the seasonal delicacy will fetch the highest prices of the year. So that vignette of island life could be located almost anywhere in post-settlement within the high islands of Oceania. It reflects the islanders' understanding of the connections between oceans, rivers, land, culture, economy, and human well-being on islands, and of hope and happiness and resilience gained from this traditional knowledge of natural process and pattern. Also highlighted are the specialized coevolution of the life histories of the island inhabitants, the delicate and unique nature of island systems, species, and cultures, and the sense of place and home that's rooted in the geology, the biodiversity, the culture history, and the ecologically literate life. So people's health and well-being is tied to the health of ecosystems that define their lived experiences. Alas, this vignette, which is based on my experience in remote islands of PNG some 25 years ago, is becoming increasingly rare. Habitat loss and degradation, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, changing climate are undermining ecosystem functionality and service provision in these island systems, with multiple and compounded effects on human health and well-being. The primary health threats in Oceania relate to these changing socio-ecological settings, particularly infectious diseases related to water pollution and poor sanitation, and zoonotic diseases related to large numbers of subsistence livestock, animals, and informal animal husbandry practices. The urban transition is also central to the NCD, or a non-communicable disease crisis, with obesity and diabetes rising disproportionately faster in the Pacific over the past 3 decades than in the rest of the world. So for this talk, I'm going to try and unpack that vignette that I just read using the geophysical unit of a water catchment, also known as a river basin or a watershed, as a major intersection point in which to study the relationships between socio-ecological condition, biodiversity, and human health, and also a valuable context in which to design interdisciplinary approaches to water governance. So a water catchment is the spatially bound geophysical unit within which the surface and sort of shallow groundwater drain to a single collecting stream or river. Catchments are both model and metaphorical systems. They're open and hydrologically permeable, yet they're representable as functionally distinct. They're hierarchical, so they're composed of subsystems, and they're always nested within larger systems. And they're literally and metaphorically exemplify the upstream and the downstream. So they show that upstream effects have downstream consequences. So water catchments also include the associated social actors and institutions that are located within the boundaries, recognizing that distant individuals residing within the same water catchment often share a more related environmental exposure history than near individuals in separate water catchments. So, after the storm, tropical storms, cyclones, and the associated flooding are amongst the most common natural disasters in the region. With an average of 5 to 6 tropical cyclones annually, the Pacific region has the highest frequency of recorded cyclones. This is Cyclone Winston, which hit Fiji in February of 2016. It was a Category 5 cyclone with wind gusts reaching up to 300 kilometers an hour and massive sea swells of in excess of 15 meters high. It left 44 people dead, 45,000 people displaced, 350 people directly impacted, and about nearly $1 billion worth of damage. It made Winston second only to Haiyan, tropical cyclone, Typhoon Haiyan, as the strongest cyclone to make landfall anywhere on Earth in recorded history. And this is what the areas directly hit look like. The health threats from climate change and natural disasters are again amplified by high levels of dependence on natural resources for subsistence and populations that are concentrated around the sort of low-lying floodplains and coastal margins. Obviously there's the direct impact of traumatic injury and death from extreme weather events like this, but indirectly there's the risk of a range of health effects resulting from compromised supply of water and food, safety of food and water, and the short and long-term mental health consequences of these disasters. So This is a generalized model, conceptual model of the mechanisms determining health and livelihood outcomes during cyclones or prolonged rain in the context of high islands, water catchments. So as catchments become converted through road building or logging or deforestation, there's increased potential for flooding following these torrential rainfall, obviously. The floodwater can cause damage to waste management and sanitation and cause people to come in closer contact with each other and their livestock as they all crowd together in dry places. And there can also be increased bacterial carriage associated with sediment that's eroded from the land. And all of these factors are associated with increased transmission of bacterial disease. At the same time, the increased sediments and nutrients in the runoff can impact the condition of rivers, the nearshore marine systems like seagrasses and coral reefs, and the availability of fish and invertebrate resources that people rely on for nutrition and livelihoods and cultural practice. And so how these pathogens are transmitted or the food fishes are accessed is, of course, mediated by a variety of sociocultural and behavior factors. So we know from some of our earlier work in Fiji that the most heavily cleared catchments for logging and agricultural conversion have both decreased diversity and abundance of fish. You can see that when a catchment has less than around 50% forest cover, that only the hardiest species really survive. Introduced species such as Tilapia also contribute to the native species decline. Interestingly, if you see that little green square there, a community tambu or a protected area with low forest cover but preserved riparian vegetation strips, those that like what I called the emerald edge, and regulated fishing and waste disposal, they had higher than average numbers. So we've also observed that on average, stream networks that have established tilapia populations had 11 fewer species of native fish than relatively intact systems, and the effects of forest cover and the introduced invasive fish are often coupled because invasives are more likely to establish and have higher abundance in degraded streams. And this relationship has to do a lot with the high level of inter-habitat connectivity found in the specialized life history patterns of the majority of aquatic macrofauna that you find in tropical and subtropical islands. This is almost always involves some form of diadermy, so where there's migration between freshwater and the ocean. And the most common type of diadermy that you see in these systems is a specialized form called amphidromy, where reproduction occurs in freshwater. It's followed by an obligate downstream migration of the larvae and a period of several months of growth at sea, and then before returning en masse to freshwater habitats as post-larvae. Okay, this strategy is probably an adaptation to high islands, which are characterized by kind of temporal impermanence of streams. So if we think back to that vignette, this post-level migration, which island peoples are very acutely attuned to, usually occurs in big migrations, usually on the new moon when tidal extremes are the highest, and cued by large pulses of fresh water after a storm. And these post-larval migrations, they're commonly referred to as whitebait or white gold because the value of them is up to like 110 to 150 bucks a kilo for this very seasonal delicacy. It's also important seasonal input into food webs all throughout the catchment and also in the nearshore ocean as well. So one important reason why this phenomenon is becoming rare and rarer is because many of the water catchments that are degraded or invaded, as it may be, have severely reduced larval survivorship. The sediment smothers the resting habitat, the food sources. It makes finding food harder. The tilapia stir up the sediment while they're nesting, and they eat the eggs and the larvae as they run the gauntlet of the catchment. You can see by these almost transparent post-larval gobies that are almost only about a centimeter in length why you would only basically see thousands of tiny eyes surging upstream. So these conspicuously absent species in degraded water catchments are the many migratory species that form important commercial and cultural fisheries for Pacific Islanders, such as whitebait, as well as the larger traditional food fishes. We see that these effects are largely seasonal and magnified in degraded water catchments. In the more degraded catchments of Madawata, at the top there, the abundance and diversity of fishes drops during the rainy season as runoff and associated sediment loads make the rivers less habitable. But in the more intact systems, you see that the stormwater and the rainy season actually becomes the additional habitable space, and so diversity and abundance of fish actually increases. So forest loss and increased soil erosion at the scale of water catchments is reducing abundance and diversity of freshwater resources important for livelihoods and cultural practice, particularly during flooding. We also see that in catchments where there's a lot of sedimentation and erosion, there are significant physiological effects on the aquatic fauna. Hess et al. Recently examined gill morphology and gill microbiome in clownfish larvae, and they exposed to suspended sediment. And the gills of the larvae exposed to 45 mils per liter of sediment had this excessive mucus discharge and growth of protected cell layers that resulted in 56% thicker gill epithelium. They also found a shift from the healthy to pathogenic bacterial communities on the gills. And you can see, particularly in that orange area there, where it's a big increase of the family of staphylococci on the gills. So that can increase the disease susceptibility of the larvae, but it might be also interesting worth investigating if similar microbiome shifts are occurring in common aquatic food fishes as well. So the field of human microbiome research has really advanced very, very swiftly. Changes in the human microbiome, particularly that of the gut, have been found to associated with a wide variety of diseases. Our recent research comparing populations from Fiji and the US demonstrate that the mobile gene pools in the gut microbiome are shaped by environmental selection at global scales and individual scales. Here you can see distinct Fijian and US populations, but you can also see distinct Fijian provincial populations. And so this approach basically generates the possibility of testing hypotheses on environmental condition on the human microbiome composition and the patterns of susceptibility to disease. We also know that downstream sediment smothering of the nearshore marine systems like seagrass influences the occurrence of enteric bacteria in the surrounding water. Lamb et al. Found recently that when seagrass meadows are present, there's a 50% reduction in the relative abundance of potential bacterial pathogens capable of causing disease in humans and marine organisms. Plants are important for removing pathogens and improving water quality. Natural filtration systems are widely used to remove microorganisms from terrestrial effluent, like sewage treatment works to constructed wetlands, mangrove forests, restored bivalve reefs. Ragosta demonstrated in Hawaii that every 1% decrease in the riparian vegetation along the edge of the river was associated with a 4-time increase in the enterocalcus concentration in the adjacent stream. There's clear relationships between waterborne diseases when there's extreme in the hydrological cycle, within periods of water shortage, poor hygiene and likelihood of multiple uses of the same water source is a major contributor to disease transmission, while other mechanisms such as concentrations may also be important. And then during flooding, you can see that fecal matter and associated pathogens flush from the land and damage sanitation infrastructure and contaminate drinking water. People and livestock also crowd together in dry spaces, increasing both person-to-person and livestock-to-person transmission. Upstream water catchment condition also predicts diarrheal disease. In this recent FIND study of watershed condition across 35 developing countries, Herrera et al. Found higher upstream tree cover was associated with lower probability of childhood diarrheal disease. And this effect was seen in rural areas where there was a 30% increase in upstream cover, was similar to the effect of improved sanitation. And so the authors make the important point that maintaining the natural capital within watersheds is an important public health investment, especially for populations with low levels of built capital. We also see in the Pacific Islands, following cyclones and rainfall, outbreaks of a variety of waterborne bacterial diseases such as typhoid, Shigella, and leptospirosis. This shows impacts from sequential tropical depressions on the occurrence of leptospirosis, which is transmitted by direct contact with contaminated water. Rodents, they tend to shed large amounts of this bacteria in their urine, and transmission happens through contact with the skin and mucous membranes with water, damp soil, vegetation, or mud. So basically, I spoke about water catchments and them being hierarchically scaled and nested subsystems. So I'm going to use the example of typhoid quickly to explain the kind of nested systems thinking I think is really needed for planetary health. I think that understanding the determinants of typhoid in an endemic setting is greatly enhanced by looking at the factors acting on river basin, residential, and alongside the traditional case control type studies at the household scale. So this is the central division of Fiji, where the study occurred. It's the wettest, most populous side of the island. There's about 371,000 people, and they're concentrated really along the urban centers and along the major watercourses. You can see elevation and river networks and the subcatchments, major urban centers. We used a case control design. We did details questionnaires at the household scale. We looked at bacterial contamination and chemical composition of water and soil. And we complemented this with observational and spatial analysis of households. At the river basin scale, we used spatial analysis to look at relationships between the subcatchment conditions, characteristics, and the incidence of typhoid over 30 months. So it was actually during my earlier fish surveys that we were noticing that the more degraded the catchments were, there seemed to be more outbreaks among people of waterborne diseases such as lepto and typhoid. And so here you can clearly see there's these uneven patterns of incidence and recurrence of typhoid over 30 months. And several of the subcatchments have really high incidence and recurrence, and others have low and sporadic recurrence. So what's explaining this pattern? It turns out the best predictors in the same order of importance for both incidence and recurrence are total area of high erosion risk, the percentage of the catchment that's high erosion risk, the numbers of creek crossings per kilometer of road, and the number of forest fragments within the riparian zone along the river. So overall, the determinants at this scale suggest that anthropogenic alterations of land cover and hydrology facilitate increased transmission of typhoid and increased risk of exposure where sediment yields increase following runoff. So if we zero in on the residential scale, the spatial analysis revealed that typhoid case residences were closer than the controls to water bodies, further from the nearest road and lower in elevation. Observational analysis revealed the case residences shown in red on that radar plot also had poorer stormwater drainage, more exposed bare soil, poorer household condition, and food gardens near the toilet or septic drainage. They also had less contained excreta disposal and a greater smell of feces near the toilet. So in the Fijian context and throughout much of the Pacific, it's really common to have a small garden of a root crop near the house for domestic use. And while the practice of propagating vegetables in a nutrient-rich drainage is pretty common and it's traditional right throughout the whole region, our study revealed that case household gardens were much closer to the household toilet or septic tank, and the majority of the cases propagated vegetables directly on or below the toilet drainage. So this propagation practice can be considered a form of passive use of human feces for fertilizer, and this has never really been shown for as a risk factor for typhoid, but active fertilization of produce with human feces has been implicated in it. We also found higher concentrations of E. coli in the stored drinking water, higher concentrations of phosphates in both the source and in the stored drinking water, and in the toilet drainage. So while phosphates bind to ultrafine sediment particles like silty clay, and they can be washed into water sources, and that can be a primary source of contamination, and that can be both natural and anthropogenic occurring phosphates. Our findings were that the concentration in water positively correlated with E. coli and was also significantly higher in the toilet drainage, which suggests that faulty excreta disposal is a likely source. So, residential settings with poor drainage, frequent flooding, and unimproved pit latrines, fecally contaminated and nutrient-enriched water and soil provide the ecological arena in which the risk of typhoid transmission is enhanced by individual scale risky behavior. And so here's the risk factors at the individual scale, which is based on the questionnaires. Clearly improving sanitation in the settings important, food and personal hygiene behavior like not washing your produce along with not washing your hands before eating, not having water available all the time, and having wood plank or a sand floor, but that's really a socioeconomic indicator. And the lively Fijian culture of mass gathering involving group food preparation was also a risk factor. So we know at the household or individual scale, risk of developing symptomatic typhoid relates significantly to food and personal hygiene behavior, unimproved sanitation, water access and use, social behavior, and socioeconomic status. These risky behaviors and circumstances both influence and are influenced by environmental determinants acting within the broader residential setting related to drainage, housing condition, the local sanitary conditions of water and soil, and typhoid risk within this residential arena is influenced by environmental determinants acting at that river basin or catchment scale. We know that incidence and recurrence of typhoid is associated with riparian forest fragmentation, areas of high erosion, connectivity of roads and rivers, which are influenced by and help shape the regional context of Oceania with its particular sensitivity to climate variability, natural disasters, isolation, small developing economies, rapid population growth, and environmental change. So these intersecting food and water sustainability issues are sets of nested subsystems in which water catchment systems are nested within a regional socio-political and climatic setting, and both affect and are affected by local residential settings and individual behaviors. So understanding the relationships between these nested systems requires these new transdisciplinary approaches to understand the causal relationships and provide sufficient evidence for multi-level interventions. So what I've done is I've built this Bayesian network model of the factors that determine exposure for typhi in Fiji. And I populated the different nodes from our measured or observed data that had significant associated with increased typhoid exposure. And then the general objective of the model was basically to look at significant synthesize the significant risk factors across the three nested subsystems within this set of studies and see how they conjointly influence typhoid exposure risk, and then use this model to test potential intervention scenarios. And you can alter the different states and see what the relative influence of interventions within and across the different subsystems are on typhoid exposure risk. I'm not going to go through all the different permutations, but basically you can see that you can integrate across all of these different subsystems. You have to use different methods to study those different subsystems, but you can integrate the information. A clear example is that this whole system characteristics, things emerge that you can't understand from the study of the individual systems. A good example is that risk reduction is not simply additive within a subsystem. So if you combine the different interventions and you say, what's the risk reduction of doing one particular thing within a subsystem, and you add them all together, the amount of risk that's reduced in that system is a lot greater combined as part of the whole system rather than just adding them individually. We also see that simultaneous interventions on key factors across multiple systems provide greater exposure reduction than the total elimination of all risk factors in any one subsystem. I guess one of the most important points is that with each level of subsystem investigation and intervention, you increase the level of insight and strength of your intervention effect. So vaccination, for example, can get, now with the new conjugate vaccine for typhoid, you can get rid of typhoid for 10 years within the individual. Vaccination for typhoid for that individual will only address typhoid. If you address water sanitation and drainage in the residential setting, it's going to address a whole wide range of water and food-borne diseases, and it has positive local effects on socioeconomics and mental well-being. If you address issues of land clearing and a natural and built infrastructure at a water catchment scale, it's going to have profound effects on wide-ranging concerns of biodiversity conservation, food security, and public health. So in this example, we've demonstrated that many of the upstream drivers of freshwater biodiversity loss not only facilitate the increased incidence of waterborne disease, but also potentially contribute to the physical and psychosocial impacts, identifying the precise nature of this biodiversity loss on physical health and psychosocial well-being through both nutritional and cultural deficit is a promising avenue for future research. We've also shown this, some of my colleagues have also shown similar watershed scale drivers of leptospirosis, high-density livestock farming near the rivers, increased susceptibility to flooding. You also see that community bans on harvesting and clearing within this emerald edge or the riparian area can be effective at maintaining fish diversity and abundance, even when the basin has been forested previously. The evidence suggests that similar kind of restorative action at this scale can also reduce the burden of typhoid through minimizing susceptibility to flooding and improving water quality. So taking such a transdisciplinary place-based approach has enormous potential to contribute to the way that sustainability is conceptualized and to strengthen the cross-sectoral management efforts for multiple benefits of improving environmental provision services, improving public health, and optimizing management costs. So just some research directions quickly. A huge number of planetary health research opportunities exist to develop the field of water catchment epidemiology that recognizes this particular geophysical unit as socioecologically important for understanding connections between water from headwater to coast and human health and well-being. Building greater understanding at the interface of disaster-related epidemiology and water catchment conservation, especially in the medium to long-term recovery phases, is going to significantly strengthen the thinking on both disaster risk management and conservation. In regions like the Pacific, where a large proportion of the population get their drinking water from untreated surface sources, the role of water catchment management from headwater to coasts for the provision of potable water has clear values to the WASH sector. As many of the diets in the region are very strongly linked to the state of their wetland, including nearshore environments, investigations into the dietary impacts of changes in the fish communities in ridge-to-reef linked ecosystems is a fertile ground for providing solid empirical evidence linking the health of ecosystems to human health. There's also the opportunity to explore the variation in the skin and gut microbiome of people, as well as the direct pathogenic bacterial colonization of common aquatic food sources under differing water catchment conditions, which has yet to be factored into these relationships. And of course, there are the related psychosocial and cultural implications of all of the above. So you might imagine a large complex Bayesian network model or several connected submodels predicting health in a water catchment. In any event, I'm here to explore potential collaborations in any or all of these directions, as clearly an interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral approach is needed to remove the barriers that silo human health, animal health, and the environment sectors. And we need the tools that support collective engagement, which need to be nurtured within our education system and institutions. This could be achieved by orienting around specific thematic areas like water, endeavoring not simply to collect disciplinary experts to bring their own viewpoints, but to view the issue collectively from a perspective that promotes humanitarian values of compassion, understanding, and welfare in the broadest sense. So the Dalai Lama recently tweeted, "Education today needs not only to develop our intelligence, but also to support the basic human values of warm-heartedness and compassion." These are the basic tools of engagement that can foster acceptance and understanding of the biological, cultural, political, social, and economic diversity that has to be understood to tackle the sustainability challenges ahead and to reimagine a promising future vignette of water catchments and the lives that they embrace. Thank you.